whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tona. Kia mākina kina ki ita, kia mā taratara ki tai. E he aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe mauriora. Kia ora, my name is Caro McCaw, and thank you so much, Federico, for such a generous introduction. Firstly, though, I'd just like to explain why I chose to open my talk today with a karakia. This is a New Zealand Māori ritual incantation, regularly used to open a gathering. And today I use it to open space for us to consider relationships that are useful for design, and respectfully draw upon cultural subjects. It just feels right for me to do this. I'd like to thank everybody who's been responsible for this wonderful conference. The Cumulus board members who are here, thank you. To the wonderful staff and organisers of the conference from the University of Johannesburg, thank you. Federico, for your kindness and generosity, thank you. And thank you to everybody I've met. It's been a wonderful few days here in Johannesburg. It's my first time in South Africa. So I'm from Ōtepoti, Dunedin, in the far south of New Zealand, where I'm a professor, a teacher, a mother, a sister, a friend, and a swimmer. And this is a picture I took from a local beach. And I include it here as a way of introducing where I come from and how we are connected, because the ocean does connect our two countries. And I'm really interested in the beach as a space where the sea and the sky and the air mix, and they're in constant motion. I find it's a good place to think, and to think about the local, the distance, and how entangled we are with the shifting here and now. Okay, this is another way that we could show the connections between New Zealand and South Africa. These maps show that we are both, can we go back one slide please? Yeah. So these maps show that we are both close to the Antarctic. New Zealand is slightly closer, but we are both in the global south, as I like to think, but only one of us are considered in this political category. We are both located from the source of most design thinking. And both of our countries have complex colonial histories. We're working to decolonise and define our own histories and destinies. We accept that our cultures are entangled with colonial pasts and pastimes such as cricket. And we find them deeply part of our own identities too. Neither of us are likely to see ourselves represented in a timeline of design history, for example. Design histories generally ignore culture, although they are dominated by Eurocentric worldviews. In fact, there is very little consideration for what Eurocentric design could learn from those of us outside of their self-identified history, or what we may offer. Our cultures, our perspectives, our ways of being and seeing the world. And in this talk and conference theme, I hope we can unpack and celebrate some of these cultures, perspectives, ways of being and seeing the world. We centre this conversation around the Indigenous practices and values known as Ubuntu. And as the Africans in the audience will recognise, and many have embraced in this conference, Ubuntu is a 6,000-year-old Pan-African philosophy, variously described as these things. Many have described Ubuntu more eloquently than I at this conference. I was also, on the first day of the conference, introduced to the term ukama, which talks about connecting humans, ecologies, and ancestors. And while I'm not African, I understand that there are some special qualities unique to cultural perspectives embraced by Ubuntu. And I aim to consider Ubuntu in design and design education through a New Zealand lens from where I stand. I'll share my evolving design educational engagement with the more than human as a way to consider relational approaches that help to develop methods. The term more than human refers to ecologist David Abrams' 1996 phrase, the more than human world, as a way of considering our entanglement with our earthly nature. So firstly, I'll give you some context to where I come from, work, and I teach design. And secondly, I'll draw upon some theoretical alliances, and I'll then demonstrate this approach through 2 student projects. And then hopefully consider some of the ways that we may learn from this for design and design education. So let me start by explaining my own cultural context. I am a Pākehā New Zealander. This means I'm not Maori. Maori is our indigenous population. I'm privileged to live in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and to learn from and share practices and understandings with New Zealand Māori in the context we consider biculturalism. So biculturalism is a political philosophy, and it's an understanding of each other's cultures, cultural practices that see the 2 dominant cultures of New Zealand understand and to some degree practice each other's cultures, languages and worldviews in an ongoing dialogue. We respect Māori as tangata whenua, which means people of the land, and I identify as tangata tiriti, people who have the right to call New Zealand home as a result of our founding treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi between Māori and the Crown, signed in 1840. Like most colonial treaties, it wasn't perfect, with important understandings lost in translation. But from the outset, the treaty promised a partnership in recognition of Māori people's special relationship with the land. Biculturalism aims to give Māori and Pākehā equal status, rights and protection. It requires addressing historical events, such as land loss, and promoting equal opportunities for Māori in all sectors of society. It's an ongoing project. It involves recognising and integrating Māori customary practices into our national life, such as the karakia, which we begin all our meetings with. While we recognise New Zealand as multicultural and accept a range of cultural identifiers, generally, biculturalism has a special and first place in our national identity. And we might say the key responsibility is to uphold our relationships, to keep on working on it. There are lots of examples of biculturalism in everyday life, and I return to the idea that biculturalism requires recognising and integrating Māori customary practices into our national life. It's possible, or even vital, that we're able to share our ways of seeing the world and make room for these different perspectives. So one example that made the world news is the granting of personhood to special landscapes. The first was the Wanganui River in 2017. You may well have seen this on the news. This was followed by Te Urewera, a large national forest. And earlier this year, Taranaki Maunga, a live volcano, was granted personhood in January. In each of these cases, it was argued that special environments are ancestors. And for the iwi or tribes that are responsible for caring and protecting them and to ensure their well-being, they needed to be acknowledged as people. Urewera was formerly a national park, and one could argue that this was already a special place and was already being cared for by the government. But for Tūhoi, the iwi or tribe that have the responsibility to care for this forest, it was not enough to have the land receiving a model of care that was not culturally centred or separated from their family unit. This is about mutual healing. The land, the tribe, and the people of New Zealand working together for mutual justice. And I think it's useful here to introduce 2 Māori concepts that I will return to. Oh, can we go back one, please? Thank you. The first is whanaungatanga. Well, it's a long word, don't worry about trying to say it, but it's more important that you understand what it means. So whanaungatanga refers to relationship, kinship, a sense of family connection. And it's the sort of relationships that provide people with a sense of belonging. You don't need to be related to each other to identify with this term or feel its family-like connection. And you'll know what I mean. There are people close to you in your life that aren't necessarily family, but to whom you have a family-like connection. And along with this kinship or family-like connection comes rights and obligations. Kaitiakitanga is the second of these terms, and it's a Māori concept of guardianship, protection and stewardship, rooted in a worldview that sees people as part of the natural world, not superior to it or separate from it. And the root word in here is tiaki, which means to care. It involves the responsibility to care for people, places and the environment, including the natural world, to ensure its well-being for future generations. And that's the focus of kaitiakitanga, to make sure that the future ancestors have the same ability to appreciate. It's important to note that kaitiakitanga refers not only to the environment, but also to the stewardship of other valuable resources like data and information. So DNA, for example, not just human, is protected very carefully. So in this example of a recent volcano being granted personhood status, we can see both of these concepts being recognised in law, in spirit, and in practice. The mountain is recognised as a family member in order for other family members, in this case human ones, to take appropriate care of the mountain. Iwi and government have to work collaboratively, first and foremost for the health and well-being of the mountain. And these two worldviews come together to put the well-being of the mountain into practice in what's considered a model of co-governance. In a South African book that I've been reading called Hydrofeminism, Thinking with Oceans, I came across an idea that I find useful, drawing upon Karen McCaw's notion of diffraction. A simple way of thinking about this is the way that two pebbles thrown into this river each create their own ripples. But at some point these ripples meet and a new pattern is created, in what Barad describes as a worlding process. By worlding, Barad suggests that the world is not just out there, but is actively produced and shaped through ongoing practices. Meaning and material worlds are co-created. And I think we can consider these new patterns as their own ripples, as well as those ripples begun by the adjacent pebbles. And I'd like to suggest that the care of a mountain by bicultural parties is an example of this worlding process. A new pattern is created in the meeting of two worldviews, and in a way that is specific to that mountain. And I'd also like to make a connection here with Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a collective and uniquely African worldview that I want to consider alongside and entwined with others, such as those practiced by designers and the design education practices I want to share with you from my work in New Zealand. Although I'm not South African, and Ubuntu is not my philosophy to draw upon, I hope that by introducing some of the ways that I practice New Zealand biculturalism as a design teacher, along with some of the Indigenous concepts from New Zealand, that we can open up this space and the ripples we are causing may meet and help us to develop new understandings here at Cumulus. My specific area of interest might be described as relational design, and relational design education that is culturally centred. So I'll set the scene now with some theoretical ideas that align with these interests, and then I'll show you some examples of two student projects. So relational design thinking in my background started with feminist biologist Donna Haraway in the early 1990s. Her early essay, Situated Knowledges from 1988, drew my attention to practices and technologies of visualization. Haraway was seeking to deconstruct universal truths claimed by scientific processes of replicable measurement systems. Haraway placed emphasis on local and embodied experiences, complexity and endless difference. And she suggested that we need to engage with this through the power-charged social relation of conversation. So in my mind, conversation requires us to position ourselves, to speak as well as to listen, to accept in order to respond, and to make room for difference. I think that this is a lot of what's been happening here at Cumulus over the last few days. Haraway's focus on the body as a key site of shaping knowledge resonated strongly at the time with feminist geographical scholarship. And these contemporary relational practices are situated in the body of work known as feminist new materialism. Making kin was another idea by Donna Haraway. In two of her later books, Companion Species Manifesto and When Species Meet, Haraway writes about humans are entangled with the more than human geographies, starting with our pet dogs. And this is me at a beach with my pet dog. Haraway argues that traditional distinctions between humans and animals are socially constructed. We not only share human-like love, but we also share our biota, our bacteria, and our cells. Haraway explores the entangled, co-evolved relationship between humans and dogs, arguing that it offers us a model for understanding how to live with significant otherness. So Haraway challenges human-centric views by reframing relationships as interconnected, kin-like bonds that include non-humans like animals, plants, and landscapes, promoting a view that acknowledges the agency of non-human beings. Agency, Sarah Barad argues, is not a human process, but is present in all matter, both living and non-living. And in many ways, Haraway and Barad are reflecting the thinking and practices of Indigenous communities, just coming from a different background. Haraway suggests that we use creative, immersive, and relational methods to study these multi-species entanglements and our co-created worlds. So we might imagine that design is perfectly situated to use these tools. And an example of this she calls attunement, which is a shift from seeing to sensing. So once we are aware of this entanglement, Haraway and Barad propose the concept of responsibility. This is an ethical obligation that arises from our entangled existence. Responsibility is the ability to respond and to be accountable for the complex relationships we are always part of. This, they suggest, is a practice of care and social justice, and it's embedded in all of our relationships. And these very much reflect the concepts of whanaungatanga and kaitiakitanga that I described earlier from a New Zealand Māori culture perspective. So, what does this mean for design? The works of Tony Fry and Arturo Escobar have been referred to numerous times over the last few days here at Cumulus. And they are perhaps the most important books that discuss relationality and design disciplines, in ways I think do reflect the values of Ubuntu. They discuss reality as a continuum of parts that cannot be separated or reduced to specific, discrete moments, places, or things. And they suggest that design grows out of worldviews, but is able to break away from these worldviews and redirect these worldviews, proposing new worlds. A bit like the ripples in the river. A recent review of relational design, literature by Alvarado, describes three types of relational design. The first he describes as utilitarian. And this can be considered as the various forms of relationships that can be employed in design processes, such as UX design or participatory design. Although these do encounter relationships, this is not the type that I'm interested in. The second he describes as communitarian. This considers the embeddedness of design. Designers are not outside of worlds, but participate within their communities and their own lived contexts. Relationality here can be used as a concept that helps reveal and open already existing relations in which design is embedded. And also, relationality might be a goal of design, such as strategies for community building. The DESIS workshop that I attended on the first day of this conference asked us to consider design in our own neighbourhoods. I think this is a good example of communitarian design. I've always ensured that design students engage with local communities, and my worldview is deeply communitarian. The third he describes as associative. In this understanding, the world is constituted through many links. Design interventions unpack opportunities to enable the conditions for new social relations. And in this case, the designer's role is less important than what precedes and remains after the design process. And I suggest that it's the second and third definitions of relational design that come closest to helping us find a place with which to align Ubuntu philosophies and practices that might be useful to designers. In my reading about relational design, I was drawn to design writers from New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, and I'll briefly describe some of their approaches. A small group of designers based in New Zealand and Australia, Yoko Akama, Penny Hagen, and Desna Fangas-Golan, in their 2019 paper, critique the design universalism pretended by design models for problem solving. The double diamond, they say, is simple and accessible and endlessly replicable, a process they describe as deeply colonial and conceived from a Euro-American perspective that lives through colonialism, development, and globalization. They suggest that the double diamond emphasizes a bias for action without due process and perpetuates the view of design practitioners as culturally neutral, objective, interchangeable, and ageographical. Designers, they assert, are not culturally or politically neutral. Our backgrounds matter because they have shaped the kind of designers we've become. And our socio-cultural values inevitably manifest through our designing. These designers are looking for languages and narratives around design that better account for what is needed in our communities. Their work is based on practices that already sit within New Zealand Māori and other Indigenous worldviews. They suggest that questions of power, decision-making, reciprocity, and responsibility are often left out of design education, and that this is no longer acceptable. There is indeed a trend for models that are replicable, and I draw our attention here to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, a framework often referred to in education. And while potentially providing useful shortcuts to talk about big issues, there is no mention or room for culture. Lauren Tynan is another academic writing from Australia. Although not writing specifically for design audiences, in her 2021 paper, she defines relationality as multiple truths about agency, kinship, responsibility, and practices. And I'm drawn to her efforts to make different kinds of models or frameworks for research and thinking. Here, the kin and country framework, co-developed with Dr. Michelle Bishop, uses eagle, aunt, grandmother, and granddaughter as entities and more than human perspectives to inspire students and teachers to think about their research, concepts and ideas in different non-human centric ways. Tynan and Bishop note that there was very little literature on decolonising and relational approaches to data analysis. They explore how the framework can be used to decenter the individual human researcher and invite multiple perspectives into the analysis of data. They're calling for a holistic approach that emphasises interconnectedness and considers past, present and future as unified rather than isolated variables. Can we go back? Yeah, thank you. Here in South Africa, there are a number of design initiatives, both within and outside of design education, that share relational approaches. Wharoa et al. Have described transformative narratives, fostering Ubuntu-inspired participatory design practices. Shamela Jones has written about the ethics of Ubuntu and community participation in design. And African industrial design practices that reflect this relational effort are described by Angus Campbell, Nyoni Rapistiniani, in the Bee-centred project, Beacon, first developed here in 2015 by master's student Ivan Leroy Brown at the University of Johannesburg. Extensive design and development cycles led to the current Beacon outcome. The final design considers the beehive as part of a socio-technical ecological system, including the bees. Life-centred design is an emerging approach in a philosophy that takes longer-term perspectives and goes beyond human needs to consider sustainable environmental and social outcomes. African life-centred design is a design collective that uses life-centred design approaches to reflect Pan-African knowledges and contexts. And very recently, I discovered this book by Yor Osufu Asari, published about African design futures. It explores a decolonising approach to design education, new models of creative practice in education that centre on social impact, cultural relevance and community development. So these are not movements evolving in isolation, but across the world we're responding to common experiences. So why do we need relational, culturally centred design? Well, firstly, we need to decolonise. We need other knowledge and ways of being and doing that can help us navigate new and complex problems. And we need to give respect, dignity, voice, and space to these other ways. Secondly, culture needs to find its place at the centre of learning and of design. And thirdly, our extractive consumer culture is unsustainable, and design plays a significant role in this. We need to act with responsibility. So how can we do this? Well, I remind you that kinship, care and belonging are powerful tools in the aid of responsibility. So I'm going to return now to a river and the ripples that we make, and introduce you to two student projects. Okay, this is where I work. This is Otago Polytechnic, and this is in the very south of New Zealand. And this is the building that the design school is hosted in. We are located in North Dunedin. Yes. Just outside of the building, so an orchard of apple trees. And it's part of a larger initiative known as the Living Campus. And the Living Campus started about 10 years ago, and it just started to fill in the grassy spaces with food gardens. So now we have quite an extensive community garden. So I'm a really proud advocate of the Living Campus. But it was with some horror that I discovered that most students don't know what a carrot looks like when it's growing in the ground. So for a number of years now, I've sought to develop design projects that take students outside. We just need to be outside and not only look for carrots, but understand our relationship a bit more with the outside world. So the first of the two projects I'm going to talk to you about is called Orfeo Rising. And I developed it initially with a friend and visiting scholar, Nina Ziglady. Nina is an interdisciplinary artist that works on art-science collaborations, and Orfeo is the name of the river that runs through campus. So this is a map from 1872, and you can see that the original path of the river on the right, and the two red crosses mark where the current locations of the art and design schools are at Otago Polytechnic. Most of the original shoreline has been reclaimed since then, and the city extends across most of this map. And through this project, we'd hope to connect students from the art and design schools, who are usually quite separate, and to each other and to the river that normally divides us. So Orfeo Rising was a collaborative teaching and learning project that drew together multiple perspectives of the local river as a living being, a source of both knowledge and process. We began with a public symposium, and we held it at our local museum, and this brought together different perspectives. So the first was social histories. We had social historians come and talk about their understanding of the river. The second was environmental histories, and similarly, how the environment was destroyed by settlers in the name of industry. And the third we learned about were cultural histories. And this is two of my colleagues at the time, Ron Bull and Simon Kahn. They're both teachers and cultural advisors, and they're part of the Māori arts collective called Kai Ho Kai, which focuses on food design and storytelling. So Ron introduced us to the concept of modi, which translates roughly to mean life force, and is perhaps closest to those ideas of agency that the feminist writers introduced. The river has its own modi. It's a life force that doesn't disappear, but it can be impacted positively or negatively. They also discussed the concepts that I introduced earlier, whanaungatanga and kaitiakitanga, being collected as family and with the responsibility of care. So, the next day, we caught the bus as close to the source of the river as we could. And we spent the rest of the day walking back along the river back to campus. It took most of the day. Students were asked to engage, to use all of their senses, and to make their own connections with the river and the new knowledge that they just learned from the symposium. So where the bus dropped us off, the river meandered through native bush. It was flowing, it was fresh. But as we headed closer to town and the campus, the river became constrained and there was more concrete than trees. And finally, towards the harbour, it looked more like a dirty drain. Here it is, close to the art school, and near the harbour at the river mouth at low tide, looking its worst, I have to say. And after a day of experiencing the river firsthand, the students could choose any aspect or part of the river and to work with as the subject of their project. Students did extra research. They looked online, and they looked at published research in the libraries. They visited museums and archives, And they built a bigger picture of their chosen aspect of the river. It might have been a part of history where it connected as the river flowed. And they developed design ideas. At one point, design and art students came together for a critique session, and they received feedback from Simon, our Māori arts advisor. That's Simon at the top left, giving his perspective. This is an important part of all the research we do at Otago Polytechnic. So, for design students, they developed project prototypes over 6 weeks, and then they presented them at a walking symposium, which took a whole day. We walked down the length of the river, and students presented at the site that they were interested in design for. And I'm going to show you 2 of these student projects, and just thinking about the way that the current and the past, the stories of the river itself, and the students' projects, all part of this diffracting worlding process. This was actually taken in Orfeo, this photograph, just recently. So the first project was called the Paper Boat Project. Oh, can we go back one, please? Thank you. So these students learned that there were certain native grasses that were very important places for fish, native fish, to lay their eggs. And without the grasses, the river heated up and the eggs were at risk of washing away in floods. So these grasses were just specific environments where the eggs stuck. So the students made their own paper using the grass seeds, these native grass seeds. And they designed a paper boat race for the local kindergarten, along with child-friendly education resources, how to make a paper boat. They prototyped the paper boat race with their classmates, just outside the kindergarten, and the prototypes were successful. The boat sank, they nestled along the riverbank where the seeds could sprout. Another group focused on the local sports field. So this is reclaimed land, what was formerly a tidal lake near the mouth of the river. The sports field is prone to flooding as it lies below sea level. And the students found local sea level rise mapping from the local council that showed that the sports field, along with the airport, will be some of the first sites of the city to be flooded with predicted sea level rise. One of the students had actually experienced knee-deep flooding quite recently at the sports field, and this group became quite angry with the sense of hopelessness associated with these predictions. So their response was designing the future. Their design was to develop a series of floating residences, and they called it the Venice of the South. They designed buildings, a brochure, and they held a mock real estate auction outside the design building. So what did we learn from this project? Well, we learned about the river from diverse perspectives. We learned some key Māori concepts for understanding and working with natural environments. We used physical experience and attentiveness as Haraway's terms to inform our learning. And we designed the land and the river in respectful ways in order to share new understandings with our local community. I'm going to turn now to a second project. Can we go back one slide, please? Thank you. So this project we called Cedar Meets Harakiki, and it was a little more ambitious. It involved students from across the Pacific Ocean, where we met online. And the project's name reflects 2 plants that are very important to the respective Indigenous communities. Harakiki is a native flax. It's an important resource for textiles and for medicine. And cedar is very valued in North America for its spiritual and practical uses, with all parts of the tree traditionally used for various purposes. So the project aimed to go a little deeper and develop and share methods and languages for connecting designers with the more than human. And alongside ecological thinking, we drew on Maori and Canadian First Nation scholars and worked with local cultural advisors. So this project was offered to 2 design classes, one in Vancouver and one in Dunedin. It started in Vancouver because we didn't exactly share the same semester timetable, but we had a 6-week synchronous window. And Professor Louise Sapierre and I had originally connected through the DESIS Lab network, and which we are both part of, and has been part of this symposium. In this project, both teachers and learners were able to share our approaches and progress in Zoom classrooms, culminating in an online exhibition and conversation. So we met several times a week. So key ideas explored through our setting up of this project involved Caro McCaw, a New Zealand Maori designer. He talks about whakapapa-centred design, which refers to respectful ancestral approaches and a design framework for ethical decision making. And we read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Grammar of Animacy, where we learned to recognise how language shapes our understanding of the world. Both texts introduced Indigenous values that centre the natural world as sentient and present with the world of humans. So we asked students to go outside. And this is the beginning of a theme, isn't it? To go outside and to choose and engage and work with a non-human being. They started with a few and then narrowed it down to one. And we wanted them to design in a way that advocated for that being. And we drew upon multiple frames to learn about this and to conceive of different possible relationships. And after conducting a series of immersive research activities, including thoughtful, sensory, and academic approaches, students drew upon their design skills to translate and share their learning. And the outcomes were a variety of prototypes designed to advocate for their chosen being. And through a combination of online and embodied learning, our explorations brought light to understandings about the fundamental interconnectedness of humans and the earth, with all species and with each other. I'll show you one project as a sample of this kind of design advocacy. So this is Libby's project. Through spending a lot of her time outside, Libby began to identify with the tree fern, or wheki. There was a particularly big one in a park near her house, and Libby sat with the tree fern every day for a week. And she began to research the fern and discovered that the once ubiquitous tree fern was actually a rhizome, perhaps like ginger. It grew underground nodes, and then the tree fern was just the sprout at the top. And she was really interested in these underground networks. Amazed, Libby went back home. And she realised that a tree fern had been waiting and watching her all along outside the kitchen window. She began having a cup of tea with the fern every day. Libby learned more about rhizomes and rhizomatic thinking, and the ferns led her to deleurs and guattari, from nature to philosophy. And Libby started to talk to her friends and family all about the tree ferns. They started to see them too, and often sent her photos. Libby's social network also operated as a rhizome. We started noticing each other. As a design prototype, Libby used open maps to develop a website where people could post their sightings and visualise this network. All of our students found this project transformative, and the students between countries made very good friends. Our engagement with the natural world opened up new worlds. What did we learn? Well, we learned from and with living systems. We used what Haraway would describe as attentiveness in design, as a design method. We acknowledged and worked with Indigenous people and cultural advisors from 2 different continents. We worked with other design students and shared our curiosity with a larger community. And we added caring, relational practices alongside our design practices. We designed in ways that advocated for a chosen being. And through our reflection as teachers, Louise and I realised that intriguing spaces opened up as a consequence of this project. The design students took up tools and the languages we offered to engage in ways that held these spaces open for periods of interconnected learning and for new conversations. Through our ongoing conversations, Louise and I identified 3 system relationships, and these can be found in an essay that we wrote called Attentive and Appreciative. The first of these system relationships was reconceiving systems. So we recognise that our emerging methods reflect those of design ethnographers, drawing on examples of observation techniques and empathetic techniques, interpretation, engagement and sense-making. However, our practice reconsiders a design system without humans at the centre. Trust and letting go. We found that this kind of learning is highly engaging, and it's available to everyone who's willing to pause and pay attention, and willing to let go of preconceptions about knowledge, about design process, and about an outcome focus. It takes personal trust, a different starting point, and an acceptance that designers can turn to design tools when they need them, rather than start with them, or let familiar tools dictate. And speaking of tools, the project helped us to reconceive what a design tool can be, and what an exploratory tool can be. For example, one design student chose to hang from a branch of a tree in order to see from a different perspective. The branch became a tool for examining different perspectives. It's only the relationship between the tree and the body that allows a tool-like quality to be identified in this moment. And this project and our reflection on it helped us to see the limitations of both tools and ethnographies, and to recognise that we can shift, change, and reconsider roles and relationships as designers. We were, in Escobar's terms, moving out of the studio and into the flow of socio-natural life. And designers were beginning to include responsibility in their approaches and practices. So working beyond and outside of traditional design frameworks can open up whole new worlds. And these kind of connected relationships help us to see the limitations and opportunities of our design languages. Recognising the mountain as a family member in order for other family members to care for it is respectful. And an example of 2 worldviews coming together to put the well-being of the mountain first. We are all better for being connected. So let me return to the beach where this talk began. A place where different systems mix. The air, the sea, and the land are in constant motion. Just like the beach, different worldviews and perspectives can and must live together. It can take time, like the tides, for these perspectives to be revealed. But this opens important possibilities for the role of design education in our own places in the world. And in this mix, we can learn to understand our very human responsibility. It's been a pleasure to share my own thoughts and projects with you today. I'm really enjoying hearing and seeing projects from this wonderful community. Thank you all so much. whātia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara. Kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Homie, huie, taiki.
Caro, thank you so much for a really beautiful reminder about responsibility, both responsibility and responsibility, and effectively proposing, I'm sorry to fall back into the trap of kind of oversimplifying systems, but proposing a sort of model that's about community, that's about curiosity, it's about culture, but most of all about care. You know, put those things at the center of design. I think, you know, we're onto something. So thank you for sharing the beautiful work that you've done with your students and for bringing that wonderful perspective of relationship between Whakawhānanga and the wood. So thank you so much. And we ask the shade and over. And of course, Caro will be available for questions and comments during the tea break. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Caro McCaw. I'm a technic, located in Ōtepoti, Dunedin, Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's my pleasure to invite you to the 2026 November Cumulus Conference here in New Zealand. We believe that we have unique perspectives and a lot to share. Our conference theme, Design at the End of the Earth, reflects our passion for design that works with nature, our focus on decolonising design education, and our deep commitment to developing sustainable design solutions. How can design and design education explore these troubling times with creativity, empathy, resourcefulness, and innovation? How can we include more than human users and develop a broader definition of design? How can we learn from our global network's diverse voices? And how can our important conversations speak through design education towards a shared vision for a positive future? Cumulus is the leading international network of art and design education and research with nearly 400 member institutions across 71 countries. Our peer-reviewed conference will draw together your design ideas, practices, research and student engagements to help develop a wider vocabulary for our network. We hope that you can join us for the conference, learn from the edges of the earth and experience some of the beautiful places and wildlife unique to New Zealand. The conference will take place from the 25th to the 27th of November here in the beautiful southern city of Dunedin. Please check our website for details about how to submit your contribution for peer review.